When Rishi Sunak came in, we were warning about the fact that there was going to be a possibility that there would be revolt after revolt after revolt after revolt, and that this was going to pretty much define all of Sunak's, prime ministership. And I think sooner or later, Sunak himself is going to have to go, I've had enough. We're going to have to go to a general election because I need to get my party under control to be able to do anything. And this is the bind that Sunak is in. He is a prime minister with the Conservative Party in a majority position. This should be easy, but it is not. And why? Because the party is fractured beyond belief. I have been talking about just how fractured the Tory party has been since the days of, Boris Johnson. In fact, even before that, going back to, the days of Theresa May, and it started really, really long before that. I mean, arguably, you could make the case this really started back in, the days of John Major, when the sort of the Eurosceptics group or the Bruges group started to sort of throw their weight around in the party. And that was sort of the start of the cracks that we've it was a crack back in 1993. Well, in 2023, it is a chasm. And it's not just one chasm. We're talking a multiple Grand Canyon scale crack, the size of which you just cannot see the bottom of because there are that many ideologies, that many differences, both politically and ideologically, and also desire for sort of self-advancement and certainly their own personal interest, which you've seen multiple times in the Tory party. Yeah, it is just so fractured at this point. The only way it can be put together is generally if Rishi Sunak basically, got out his clippers and started to, shall we say, trim the weeds. And any sort of future Conservative leader needs to actually consider doing this, or else the Conservative Party will never, ever, ever be able to govern again properly. Even should they somehow win the next general election, that does not signal that Rishi Sunak is going to be in a good position because those factions are still going to be there. So, yeah, it's not a good look, really, for the Conservatives. And as we've said this before, people do not vote for divided parties. And that goes for the same in the UK. It goes for the same around the world. People do not vote for divided parties. So let's get into this latest revolt that has just happened. And this revolt has been particularly over the online safety bill. And we're going to go today to have a look at Conservative Home to see what their take is on all this sort of revolts, these that are happening under Sunak, because these cannot continue. Sooner or later, when, as we've seen in the past, we saw a revolt about a revolt. What happens when we get to a stage where we've got a revolt about a revolt about a revolt? Just how many revolts can you have? It's insane, but this is the level that we have got to with this Conservative government. They are just ungovernable. Sunak has nowhere to go. So before we go looking at this article, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and one donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And of course, there is the YouTube thank you button and the Pony Club down below as well. And of course, remember to hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, ring the bell as well, so you get notifications of when we do a new video or when we go live. So, we'll go today to Conservative Home, with their title, this article of the revolt over the online safety bill encapsulates the bind Sunak is in. And oh boy, is this a bind. And to be honest, I think looking at, as I've sort of, as I've said, I've been reading more and more Conservative Home because I want to get the sense of what is going on in the sort of the Conservative Party, not just the parliamentary party, but also the wider non-parliamentary party. And Conservative Home, as we've said before, is quite influential in the Conservative Party. That's why we're going to look at it. That's why we covered just a few weeks ago the wacky ideas they had to try and win the next general election. Some of those, well, yeah, quite wacky indeed. But anyway, let's crack on with this. So, it is hard to think of a prime minister in modern times who has entered office in a less politically precarious circumstances than Rishi Sunak. The big picture is very bad. As the economist Adam Tooze has argued, it may very well be much bleaker than faced by the politicians in the 70s, widely considered to be the classical era of British decline. Sunak faces an economy and wages which have been generally stagnant for a long time, and a set of deep structural problems for which there are no easy solutions, not least because many of the root causes are popular with the electorate, and especially with the Tory electorate. So bear in mind, I think, Henry Hill does get it right here. He is right. These are deep structural problems. But remember, Henry, who's been in power all this time? Austerity was one of the reasons why the country got into a state that it was in. And there are ways out of it. There are ways that we can do this. There are ways that we can actually tackle this. But it will involve certainly a lot of investment. And certainly it will have to be looked at taxing those people who can afford to be taxed, namely the rich, tackling the banks. There is a ton of stuff here that has to be done, and the problem is the Conservatives do not want to touch those topics with a barge pole. But anyway, let's continue on with this. So, but the tactical political battlefield is also deeply unpromising. And not just because in the aftermath of Liz Truss, it resembles a smoking crater with the debris of the government's credibility scattered around it. The Prime Minister has taken office at the tail end of a parliament. The exigencies of the pandemic mean that there is a lot of public money to play with, and he seems to have felt the need to inherit much of his cabinet, including his Chancellor. So, I sort of disagree with this, Henry. You're trying to make excuses because there is a lot of stuff Sunak could do. It doesn't matter that it's the tail end of the parliament. Sunak could be doing stuff. He could be doing a lot of stuff, especially in the energy crisis sector, where we're seeing that happen at the moment. And yet he doesn't seem to be doing anything because he can't do anything. And it's primarily because of the amount of rebels and the different political groups that are in your own party that so far you haven't talked about. But we'll see if you do actually talk about these different factions. So here you are. So he has also mostly inherited his legislative agenda. Even if he were inclined to try and put meat on the bones of Sunakism, and there is no sign of that, there is simply no time or space to implement a different program by the next election. Again, I disagree. Technically, he's got 2 years before he has to have a next general election. That's still a lot of time that he could put some general good policies forward. But Sunak's not doing anything because he can't do anything, as we've said before. So back to it. We're one trying to design a Westminster analogue of the Kobayashi Maru, closing a 20-point poll deficit from the starting point might be it. So that's interesting. So you're considering Rishi Sunak's scenario to the unwinnable scenario from Star Trek. That just goes to show, I think, how out of ideas not only just the Conservative Parliamentary Party is, but I think it just goes to show you how out of ideas the non-parliamentary party generally is. I mean, as we've said, there is a lot of stuff Sunak could do. He could very easily do a deal with the striking workers. Everybody is saying that, except Sunak just doesn't want to, because if he did, he'd have to deal with his rebels. He could do more stuff helping people with energy, but again, he can't do that because of his rebels. He could do stuff to sort of help people who are the worst off in society by, you know, giving them more benefits money to help them out in this very difficult time, because again, inflation is just eating into benefits payments because we've had a massive rise in, you know, inflation, which has increased the price of sort of goods, especially food, which is making it even harder for these people. We've had calls today for to create a special rate of energy for people who are on benefits, so that it is easier for them to to do stuff. There is so much, so much Sunak could actually be doing, but he can't do it because his number one problem are those rebels in the Tory party. So, one thing you might want to add, what sorry, so one thing you might add would be having no majority, but as events are demonstrating, Sunak doesn't really have one. On planning reform, onshore wind, and now the online safety bill isn't proving difficult to cobble together enough Tory MPs to wreck any given piece of legislation. And that is his problem. There are so many Tory rebels that they are just ready to wreck any legislation they want, because they want, you know, as we saw with the onshore wind, we saw the rebellion over that. And to calm those rebels, yeah, Michael Gove had to come out and give those rebels a coal mine in Cumbria. And especially the online safety bill, we've seen prison sentences being enforced about this. And bear in mind, if you go and read the comments below this particular article, a lot of people are not in favor of the online safety bill. Going forward to say that the one guy in particular, from what I remember, saying that this bill is incredibly unconservative. But there you go. And yes, I know the online safety bill does have in itself a lot of problems. I know Bakura, one of the regulars we have on our channel, he posted me a link, and it's a really good blog about the online safety bill and sort of all the problems that the online safety bill has, certainly in around the areas of sort of free speech. So you wonder, where are all these free speech warriors on this bill? Why aren't they fighting against it? Well, we've said that multiple times before, because they're not interested. But there you go. So yeah, like I say, I'm sure Bakura will pop up in the comments and leave that link. And like I say, if he does, I will pin that to the top of the comments so you can all read that blog, because I think it was very, very good. But anyway, back to it. So yes, the row over the online safety bill also encapsulates the broader challenge facing successive British governments. The temptation of MPs to impose laws and regulation on an issue by issue basis versus the impact of the accumulated weight of all this on the British economy. So basically, what you are identifying here is what we have said before. It is short termism. This is nothing new. This has been going on since, well, really Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson really laid into this. He did not take any long-term views. That we knew problems were coming down the line. Everything from COVID, the energy crisis, to rising costs in food. Boris could have done something, but he didn't. He just let everything come along and then go, oh, well, now we'll have to solve it now. But by then, it was already too late. People were suffering. You've got the whole NHS crisis, which people have been warning about for years, saying you need to do something about this NHS crisis. And again, it's been hand waved away. And the NHS is in an absolute, you know, It's bad. It's bad. And it is because of this short-termism, this taking things, as you put it, issue by issue, and not really tackling or even looking forward to a long-term plan. So, back to it. So, in this case, what the rebels, such as Miriam Cates or Simon Fell, are demanding is that senior executives at social media companies be made personally criminally liable for failing to ensure that laws governing unsafe content are properly enforced on their platforms. This isn't absurd on the face of it. The best way to ensure anything is enthusiastically and enforced is to have clear personal consequences for people best positioned to enforce it if it isn't. And we could very easily, it's kind of funny because this is a lot of the case a lot of us on the left were making about people, certainly in the banking industry around 2008. There were very clearly a lot of very dodgy things going on, and some of these things should have absolutely been investigated to take over their personal consequences and find out what they knew about this. But of course, the Conservatives threw a complete hissy fit about this. And once again, we see the bizarre, strange double standards here. But there you go. So, and of course, also, how are you going to enforce this? Let's say if this is on, I don't know, a foreign server or a company that isn't in the UK. How do you enforce this on someone? There's so many questions about this as like a concept. How do you actually do this? None of it makes sense, and you see why. To be honest, um, a lot of the bills coming from the Conservatives, especially from the Truss times, and remember this goes back to the Boris times, and this was obviously Nadine Dorris's, um, you know, sort of passion project, I suppose. These bills are very poorly written. They don't really seem to have a clear objective, although at least they think they have a clear objective, but it's not really stated how well to do this actually in the bill. And as we've always said, policy matters. What's in the bill, how it's written matters. But anyway, back to it. But it was rejected during the bill's consultation stage on the grounds that it would make the UK's tech sector, which we are trying to grow, less competitive. And executives and investors alike would understandably be wary about committing to a jurisdiction with such unusually broad exposure to criminal prosecution. And the impact would be less investment, less growth, and fewer jobs. However, those losses are largely abstract, and by the dint of the residing down paths not taken, the intangible a weakness they share with the dividends of building houses, investing in nuclear, expanding our airports, and so on and so on. Where the harms of failing on police and online spaces are at least at the most tragic and very tangible indeed, even if the overall gain doesn't match the diffuse benefits of growth. That's, again, interesting. They should say that again. They talk about the non-tangible benefits versus the tangible benefits. You can absolutely see a tangible benefit in not building houses. This is why I've said before, we are in a housing crisis. And I'd say now we have to take this a step further and say we are in a housing disaster. I think Labour should really start calling it that. I really think they should. But anyway, back to it. Moreover, people who are constantly penalised by the proposed amendments, the tech executives, are not especially sympathetic demographic. Think of Nick Clegg. Is no Conservative idea of a rallying cry. For Sunak, the temptation must be to give in. He has not previously shown much appetite for picking a fight with his backbenchers, even as on planning reform. Labour votes were potentially available, and The bill is not, after all, his baby. Moreover, it has nothing to do with the 5 promises he made to the nation earlier this month. If Downing Street is looking to zero in on a tightly defined and deliverable goals, scrape the barnacles off the boat, as it were, and the extended trench warfare of a Boris Johnson's legislative programme is obviously an attractive use of time or political capital. Except that's the problem. That's the problem. You are not talking really about the problem. The problem is, as you've said, the trenches have been dug. You've literally got Boris Johnson in there with a whistle, and not only that, you've got multiple trenches with all these different factions, with all these different leaders sitting there with their whistle, waiting for their moment to go over the top. That's the problem in the Conservative Party. They're all ready to just have a big scrap. And to be honest, the best thing that could happen for the party, which would be fantastic for us as well, is just to let them fight. And Sunak doesn't want to do that because I think he's worried generally about having that fight. And again, like I say, watching them and seeing this fight would be incredibly funny. It would absolutely be incredibly funny to see. But yeah, we'll see. And lo, we have media reports that ministers are seeking a deal with the rebels. In theory, rolling over ought to be no guarantee of a quiet life. Though the online safety bill does anger another prominent part of the Conservative coalition, namely the Libertarian bit, where concerns about freedom of speech meet a preoccupation with growth. So at least you do admit about the challenge. That's the first point. You've really mentioned the problem in the Conservative Party. It is the fact that you have so many factions in there, not just the Libertarian faction, but at least you've acknowledged there is a bit of a problem with factions. I'd say it's the main problem, and certainly Sunak's biggest problem. He is a tightrope walker. He has such a, he is literally walking on dental thread. He has no room to maneuver, and he has to try and perform this great balancing act, and he can't. He cannot do anything. Hence why we are going to see this time and time and time again. When it comes to these pieces of legislation that he's trying to pass through, there are going to be rebels who make demands, and they are going to get their way. Sunak has already demonstrated that if you rebel, you will get what you want. So the idea that he can stand up and say no, it's too late. The horse has already bolted. It's already started. He cannot now start walking back this, because there will now be rebellions over rebellions over rebellions. And that is no way to run a political party. That is a party that is just completely and absolutely ungovernable. But you can see why certainly Henry Hill, the guy who's sort of writing this, is desperately trying not to admit the real problem in the party. But there you go. So, yet in the wake of the Truss collapse, that section of the party has rather had the wind taken out of its sails. They're still there. They're still ready to cause trouble, but you say, oh, there's going to be trouble. Oh, yes, they absolutely are ready to cause trouble. Don't get me wrong. They are ready to go there. But, however, this imbalance of organization may not last. The Times reported that next week we'll see the launch of a new Trussite caucus, apparently backed by more than 40 MPs. Oh no! Oh no! And another faction within the Tory party, a Trussite faction. Oh, don't get me wrong, that's glorious news. That is glorious news. That's going to be fantastic to see, absolutely, when that launches. Oh boy. oh boy, get ready for that. Oh, and once that gets off the ground, it will provide yet another vector along which the government's paper majority can dissolve and restrict the Prime Minister's room to manoeuvre even further. What what do you mean paper majority? He has no majority. Sunak is not governing as a prime minister who has a majority. A lot of people have said it. Sunak is acting as if he has a majority of less than 10. And he is presuming that every bill that is going to go forward is going to lose. That is why he is doing all these deals. That is why he is constantly rolling over to all these rebels. And if he should stop at any point, that's the point where we could get some serious problems. That's why this Trussite caucus is now forming, because they can now get organized to start getting their agenda through, because Sunak is so weak. So, but let's finish this off then. So, all the more reason perhaps for Sunak to cut deals while he can. It has been a long time since British governments constantly took a long-term approach to the governing, after all, and few leaders have been worse positioned than to do so than he. Yeah, just interesting that he can't actually admit what the problem is in the Tory party. It's all these rebels. It's all these different factions going at each other constantly. That's the problem. That's the problem. That's why it has led to this short termism, because they are so terrified that if they took like a long term view with a bill, you'd have a faction come zooming in going, you can't do that because that's not conservative, or that's not libertarian, or that goes against our whatever principles of like the ERG, or whatever. So you can't have these long-termism bills because there are so many rebels who just will not let that long-term view happen. And that is the real problem in the Conservative Party. And to be honest, it's hilarious. It is absolutely hilarious that they cannot identify their own problem within their own party and maybe even try to take steps to try and solve those problems. But as we've said before, just a few moments ago in the video, the Conservative Party not only is the parliamentary party completely out of ideas to be able to solve any of these problems, but even the non-parliamentary party is out of ideas completely. And I have to wonder if really the non-parliamentary party, oh, pardon me, is just as fractured, which could lead to some even more fun times, certainly when this civil war eventually happens. And I think it will be after they lose the next election, because, hey, once they lose the next election, there's no goodies to give out. There's no way to please these people. And to be honest, they're going to fight. And oh boy, as was pointed out there, the trenches are dug. And it's not just one set of trenches. You've got multiple sets of trenches with machine guns, artillery, the whole kit and caboodle, lined up to help support some of these, trench assaults that we're going to see running along these fights that are going to happen. And trust me, they're all sat there, whistles in hand, waiting to blow. And when they do, oh boy, is it going to be a absolute, blue on blue chaos. And it's going to be fantastic to watch. And even better, now that we know that there is a Trussite faction forming. I just, oh dear. So yeah, as always, guys, like I say, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, guys, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, do remember to ring the bell if you haven't done so already. And of course, we'll see you all next time.